Story number 1.
The snowstorm of January 1985 is something I'll never forget. It was one of those storms that doesn't just inconvenience you, it traps you, isolates you, and forces you to face things you'd rather not. It's also the closest I've ever come to believing in ghosts. I was 24 years old at the time and working as a seasonal ranger at a remote state park in northern Michigan. My job was to monitor the trails and keep the cabins stocked for winter hikers or snowshoers. Most of the time, the park was empty during winter. It wasn't exactly a prime vacation spot in January, especially with temperatures regularly dipping into the negatives. That month's storm, however, was beyond anything we'd seen in years. It hit hard and fast, burying everything under several feet of snow and knocking out power to the entire region. I'd planned to ride out the storm in the ranger station, a small, sturdy building with a wood stove and a pantry stocked with enough canned goods to last weeks. But things changed when I got a distress call over the radio the morning the storm started. A man, his wife, and their teenage son had rented one of the park's more remote cabins for a weekend getaway, unaware of the storm heading their way. The man's voice was panicked as he explained that their car wouldn't start and they were out of firewood. They were cold, stranded, and had no way of getting help. Against my better judgment, I decided to check on them. It was part of my job, after all, and the thought of a family freezing to death on my watch wasn't something I could live with. I loaded up the park's snowmobile with extra blankets, firewood, and food, and set off toward the cabin. It was about 5 miles from the ranger station, tucked deep into the woods. The ride was brutal. The snow was falling so thick and fast I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The wind howled like a living thing, and the cold bit through every layer of clothing I had on. But eventually, I saw the faint outline of the cabin through the trees. When I arrived, I was surprised to find the door slightly ajar. I called out, "Hello? It's the park ranger." But there was no response. I pushed the door open further and stepped inside. The cabin was freezing. The wood stove was cold and empty, and the only light came from my flashlight. The blankets I'd brought were still neatly folded on the couch where I'd left them during my last visit to restock the cabin. It didn't look like anyone had been there recently. I was confused. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. Still no answer. I checked the small bedroom and the bathroom. Both were empty. There were no bags, no coats, no sign of the family I'd spoken to on the radio. I even stepped outside to make sure I'd reached the right cabin. The snowmobile tracks were already disappearing under the falling snow, but I could see the cabin number on the wooden sign nailed to the porch. I was in the right place. Panic started to creep in. Had they left on foot, trying to make it back to their car or another cabin? That seemed unlikely in this weather, but there was no other explanation. I decided to start a fire in the wood stove to warm the place up and wait. Maybe they'd return, or maybe I could figure out what to do next after the storm let up. As I was stacking the logs, I heard a sound behind me, a soft, rhythmic tapping. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound was coming from the bedroom. Slowly, I turned and shone my flashlight in that direction. The door, which I'd left open, was now closed. I walked to the bedroom door, my boots crunching on the wooden floor, and placed my hand on the knob. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, as if someone or something was on the other side. With a deep breath, I flung the door open and shone the flashlight inside. Nothing. The room was empty, just as I'd left it. I tried to shake off the unease. "It's just the wind," I muttered to myself, though I didn't quite believe it. I went back to the wood stove and lit the fire, my hands trembling slightly as I worked. The cabin started to warm up, but the oppressive feeling in the air didn't go away. Then I heard the radio. It was faint at first, just static mixed with whispers of voices. I glanced over at the handheld radio I'd left on the kitchen counter. The voices grew louder, and I recognized the man's panicked tone from earlier that morning. "Help? Can't. Cold." His voice cracked, cutting in and out. I grabbed the radio and pressed the button. "This is the park ranger. Where are you?" Silence. Then, a faint reply, "Still here. Still here." The static faded and the cabin was silent again. My blood ran cold. If they were still here, why wasn't there any sign of them? Why wasn't the wood stove burning when I arrived? I didn't have long to think about it. The tapping started again, louder this time, and coming from multiple directions, the walls, the windows, the ceiling. It was an unnerving, deliberate sound, like knuckles rapping against wood. The fire flickered violently, and I felt a sudden rush of cold air as if the door had been thrown open. But when I turned to look, the door was shut tight. I stood frozen in place, every instinct in my body screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't move. And then I saw them. 3 figures, standing just outside the cabin's single window, barely visible through the frost and snow. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. The man, the woman, and the boy, exactly as the man on the radio had described his family. Their faces were pale and expressionless, their eyes dark voids that seemed to drink in the light from the fire. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "What do you want?" I shouted, though I didn't expect an answer. And then they vanished. The fire sputtered out, plunging the cabin into darkness. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural moan that seemed to echo from the very walls. The cold was unbearable now, seeping into my bones. I grabbed the flashlight and bolted for the door, fumbling with the latch in my panic. As I stumbled outside, I looked back at the cabin one last time. The window was dark, but I could feel their presence, watching me. The snow had already covered my tracks, and I barely made it back to the ranger station alive. The next day, when the storm had subsided, I reported what had happened to my supervisor. A search team went out to investigate, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no bodies, no sign that anyone had been at the cabin. They chalked it up to stress and isolation, a trick of Thorn. But I know what I saw. And every January, when the snow starts to fall and the wind howls through the trees, I can still hear the tapping. I still see their faces, pale and cold, watching from the shadows. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The snowstorm of January came with little warning. By midday, the light flurries predicted had turned into a whiteout, with winds strong enough to rattle the windows of my cabin. I'd planned this trip as a solitary retreat, a chance to disconnect from the city and recharge in the quiet of the mountains. But by the time the sun vanished behind a curtain of swirling snow, I was beginning to regret my decision. The cabin wasn't new to me. It had belonged to my family for generations, sitting isolated at the edge of a frozen lake. My grandfather used it as a hunting lodge, and my father had taken us there during summers for fishing trips. I hadn't been back in over a decade, but something about its rustic charm and the promise of solitude had called to me this year. That charm, however, began to fade as the storm worsened. By nightfall, the wind had grown ferocious, howling like a wild animal as it tore through the trees. Snow piled against the door and the windows fogged over, blocking any view of the outside. The cabin's old wood stove provided warmth, but the heat barely reached the far corners of the room. I sat by the fire, a blanket draped over my shoulders, and tried to read, but my mind kept drifting to the storm. It wasn't just the sound of the wind that unnerved me. It was the silence that followed. Between gusts, the quiet felt too heavy, too unnatural. Around 10 p.m., I heard the first knock. It was faint but deliberate, coming from the front door. I froze, the book slipping from my hands. No one should have been out there. The cabin was miles from the nearest neighbor, and the snowstorm had made the narrow road leading in completely impassable. For a moment, I told myself it was just the wind, a branch hitting the door, or snow shifting off the roof. But then it came again. 3 distinct knocks. Grabbing the flashlight from the table, I approached the door. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. There was no response. I hesitated, then unlocked the door and cracked it open. The cold hit me like a wall, and the wind threatened to rip the door from my hands. I shone the flashlight onto the porch, but it revealed nothing. Just snow, swirling and unbroken, with no sign of tracks leading to or from the cabin. I shut the door quickly, locking it again, and told myself it was nothing. Maybe the storm was playing tricks on my ears. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The knocking came again an hour later. This time, it wasn't just at the door, it was at the windows, soft taps like fingers brushing against the glass. I didn't dare investigate. Instead, I stoked the fire higher and turned on every battery-powered lantern I had, hoping the light would push back the shadows creeping into the corners of the room. That's when I heard the footsteps. They started softly, as if someone was walking on the snow outside. At first, I thought it might be an animal, a fox or a deer, maybe, but the sound was too deliberate. Slow, heavy steps circled the cabin, crunching through the snow. I listened, holding my breath as they moved from one side to the other, pausing near the windows. I clutched the poker from the fireplace, my hands shaking. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only the sound of the wind. Then I heard something I'll never forget, a low, guttural whisper. It was faint, barely audible over the storm, but it sent a chill down my spine. The words were indistinct, as though spoken in a language I didn't understand, but the tone was clear. Menacing. I wanted to run, to get in my car and drive as far from the cabin as possible. It's like that, but I knew the road was buried under feet of snow. I was trapped. I tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was the storm, distorting sounds, or my imagination running wild. But when I glanced at the frosted window nearest the door, I saw it. A face. It was faint, almost like a reflection, but it wasn't mine. The features were pale, hollow, and staring directly at me with dark, sunken eyes. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. When I looked again, the face was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers continued, growing louder, circling the cabin like a sinister chant. I huddled by the fire, clutching the poker and praying for dawn. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I must have dozed off. When I woke, the fire had burned low, and the whispers had stopped. Outside, the storm was finally easing, the wind no longer screaming but whimpering in the distance. With the first light of morning, I decided to leave. I didn't care if the snow was still deep. I couldn't stay in that cabin another night. I packed my things quickly and stepped onto the porch. The air was biting, but the storm had left a strange stillness in its wake. The snow was deep, nearly up to my knees, and untouched except for one thing: footprints. They circled the cabin over and over again, their shape unnatural, long, narrow, and clawed like nothing I'd ever seen before. My stomach churned as I followed them to the back of the house, where they abruptly stopped as if whatever had made them had simply vanished. I drove as far as I could, my tires slipping on the unplowed road until I reached the main highway. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. How could I? They'd think I was crazy. But I knew what I'd experienced was real. Something had been there that night, something that wasn't human. The cabin still stands, as far as I know. My family sold it not long after, and I've never been back. But every January, when the snow falls heavy and the wind howls through the trees, I think about that night, about the knocking, the whispers, and the face at the window, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for the next storm to bring it back. Story the end. The snowstorm arrived like a living thing, sudden and furious. The forecast had called for light flurries, but by nightfall, the world was suffocating under thick, swirling drifts of snow. It was January, the coldest month of the year, and I was stranded in the old cabin my friend Eric had lent me for the weekend. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a chance to disconnect from work in the city. But as the storm howled outside, rattling the windows and pressing against the wooden walls, I felt anything but at peace. The cabin stood alone at the edge of a frozen lake, its nearest neighbor miles away. Eric had warned me about the isolation, but assured me the place was well-stocked and cozy. I'd brought enough food for a few days and a stack of books to keep me occupied. By the time the storm hit, I was tucked inside with the fire crackling and a steaming mug of coffee in hand. It should have been perfect. Instead, an inexplicable unease began to creep over me as the evening deepened. It started with the knocking. At first, I thought it was the wind. The storm battered the cabin relentlessly, and the old wood groaned under its weight. But the sound was too deliberate. 3 sharp knocks, evenly spaced, coming from the front door. I froze, the book I'd been reading slipping from my hands. No one should have been out there. The road leading to the cabin was buried under snow, and I hadn't seen another car for miles when I arrived. My rational mind told me it was just a branch or a trick of the wind, but the knock came again, louder this time. Grabbing the flashlight from the table, I approached the door. My heartbeat thudded in my ears as I turned the lock and cracked it open. The icy wind clawed at me immediately, and snow swirled in the beam of the flashlight. But there was nothing there, just the untouched white expanse of the porch and the storm raging beyond. I shut the door quickly, bolting it this time. The unease clawed at me, but I forced myself to sit back down by the fire. It was just the wind, I told myself. Nothing more. Yet the silence that followed felt heavier than before, as if the storm itself was listening. An hour passed, maybe 2. I had nearly convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing when the knocking returned. This time, it wasn't just at the front door. It came from the windows, from the walls, from every direction at once. A frantic, uneven rhythm that made my skin crawl. The sound seemed to vibrate through the cabin, drowning out the wind and the crackling of the fire. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. The knocking stopped instantly, plunging the cabin into an oppressive silence. My breath came in short gasps, and I felt the weight of the stillness pressing down on me. The fire flickered weakly, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. And then I heard the footsteps. They were faint at first, crunching in the snow outside, slow, deliberate, and unhurried. They circled the cabin, pausing near the windows before moving on. I tried to peer outside, but the frost-covered glass revealed nothing but darkness and the swirling storm. I gripped the poker from the fireplace, my knuckles white. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence again. Then came the voice. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, but it was there. A low, raspy whisper that seemed to seep into the room itself. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Cold, angry, and full of malice. My heart raced as I backed away from the window, clutching the poker like it was a lifeline. "Leave me alone," I shouted, but the voice only grew louder, more insistent. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once, filling the room and drowning out my thoughts. The fire sputtered and died, plunging the cabin into darkness. The flashlight in my hand flickered, casting erratic beams of light across the room. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized there was something in the corner of the room. A figure, tall and thin, its features obscured by the darkness. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was suffocating. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in the faint light. I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the rug and falling to the floor. When I looked up, the figure was gone. But the feeling of being watched remained, an oppressive weight that pressed down on me from every angle. I crawled to the fireplace and fumbled for the matches, desperate to relight the fire. As the flames roared back to life, the whispers faded, replaced by the sound of the storm outside. But the footsteps remained. They circled the cabin relentlessly, their rhythm never changing. I didn't sleep that night, too afraid to close my eyes. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind made me jump. The figure didn't return, but its presence lingered, a shadow that refused to leave. When the storm finally broke the next morning, I wasted no time. I packed my things hastily, my hands trembling, and dug my car out of the snow. The road was treacherous, but I didn't care. I had to leave. As I backed out of the driveway, I glanced at the cabin one last time. In the upstairs window, I thought I saw movement, a flicker of shadow, gone in an instant. My stomach churned, and I slammed the car into gear, tearing down the snow-covered road without looking back. I haven't spoken to Eric about what happened that night. I don't think he'd believe me. The cabin still stands, as far as I know, but I'll never set foot there again. Whatever was out there in the snowstorm of January, it wasn't human, and I have no intention of finding out what it wanted.
Story number 4.
The snowstorm came without warning, swallowing the entire town in a matter of hours. By the time I realized how bad it was already too late to leave. The roads were impassable, the wind howled like a feral beast, and the snow piled high against the windows of the old house I had rented for the weekend. I had driven up to the remote property in Vermont to spend a few days away from the noise of the city, hoping for peace and solitude. What I found was something entirely different. The house itself was ancient, its timbered walls creaking with age. I'd found it online, a cheap rustic cabin tucked away in the woods. It had no neighbors for miles, which I thought would be perfect. The listing mentioned a history. Built in the late 1800s, originally a hunting lodge, it had passed through multiple owners before falling into disrepair. A local couple had restored it and started renting it out, boasting its charm and rich character. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, as the storm raged outside, the house felt oppressive, as though it was breathing along with the wind. By nightfall, the power went out. The lights flickered once, then died, leaving me with only a few candles and the faint glow of the fireplace. I wrapped myself in blankets and tried to focus on my book, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The wind battered the house relentlessly, and every so often it sounded like something or someone was moving just outside the window. I told myself it was just the storm. What else could it be? Around 9 p.m., I heard the first knock. It was soft but deliberate, coming from the front door. I froze, my book sliding off my lap. The sound came again, 3 distinct knocks, firm but not forceful. My heart raced. There was no reason for anyone to be out here in this weather. The nearest neighbor was over 10 miles away, and the road leading to the house was buried under at least 2 feet of snow. I stood, grabbing the flashlight from the table. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. The knocks came again, this time louder. I hesitated for a moment before approaching the door, my fingers gripping the flashlight tightly. "Who's there?" I asked again, trying to keep my voice steady. Nothing but the sound of the wind. Slowly, I unlocked the door and cracked it open. The cold hit me like a slap, and snow swirled into the entryway. Shining the flashlight outside, I saw nothing but a blank expanse of white. No footprints, no sign of anyone. I shut the door quickly and locked it, my breath fogging in the frigid air. I tried to tell myself it was just the storm. The wind, the settling of the old house, anything but what my mind was starting to suggest. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me like a second skin. An hour later, the knocking returned. This time, it wasn't just at the door. It came from the windows, the walls, even the roof. The knocks were irregular, like someone or something was circling the house, testing its boundaries. My chest tightened as I moved from room to room, peering through the frosted glass. The snow outside was untouched, pristine, and yet the knocking persisted. The air in the house grew colder, the fire in the hearth barely holding against the chill. I could see my breath now, each exhale a cloud of fear. Then came the sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. They were faint but distinct, crunching through the snow just outside the house. I followed the sound to the kitchen window and peered out, my heart pounding. Again, there was nothing there. No tracks, no movement, just the endless, swirling snow. I tried to call someone, anyone, but my phone had no signal. Even if I could get through, what would I say? That I was being haunted by something I couldn't see. I felt trapped, the house itself becoming a prison as the storm howled outside. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I strained to listen, I realized they were voices. Low, indistinct murmurs, like a conversation just out of earshot. The voices grew louder, overlapping until they filled the room. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger, desperation, and something else. Something darker. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The whispers were inside my head now, echoing in my skull like a terrible chorus. I stumbled back into the living room, desperate to relight the fire. The room felt impossibly cold, the kind of cold that settles deep into your bones. My hands shook as I struck a match, and for a moment, the tiny flame illuminated the room. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the firelight, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, its outline barely visible in the dim light. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and piercing. I froze, the match burning down to my fingers. When I blinked, the figure was gone. The whispers stopped. The house was silent again, but the silence was worse than the noise. It pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I backed toward the door, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But I knew I couldn't. The storm had made sure of that. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear. The figure didn't return, but its presence lingered, a weight that pressed down on the entire house. I sat by the fire, clutching the poker like a weapon, my eyes darting to every shadow. I didn't sleep. I barely breathed. When dawn finally broke, the storm had subsided. The world outside was blanketed in an eerie, pristine silence. I packed my things hastily, throwing them into the car without bothering to check if the roads were clear. As I turned the key in the ignition, I glanced back at the house one last time. In the upstairs window, I saw it. The figure, watching me. It didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there, its dark outlines stark against the pale morning light. I slammed my foot on the gas and didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I never told Eric what happened. I couldn't bring myself to. The house is still there, I'm sure, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitor. But I'll never go back. Whatever was in that house, it wasn't human, and it wasn't finished with me. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The snowstorm began late in the afternoon, a slow, relentless fall of white that quickly turned into a blinding wall of icy chaos. By the time I realized how bad it was, I was already halfway up the mountain, miles from the nearest town. The winding roads were barely visible, and my car was struggling against the accumulating snow. My destination was a cabin I had rented for a weekend getaway, just me, some books, and the solitude of nature. I hadn't expected the storm to hit so hard. The radio forecast had mentioned light flurries, but this was something else entirely. It was as if the mountain itself wanted to trap me. I finally reached the turnoff for the cabin, my tires slipping on the unpaved road. By the time I parked, the snow was already past my ankles. The cabin was smaller than I'd imagined, an old structure with weathered wood and a slanted roof. It sat alone, surrounded by towering pines weighed down with snow. Inside, it was rustic but warm. A single room with a wood stove, a tiny kitchenette, and a bed tucked into the corner. I lit a fire, unpacked my things, and tried to settle in. Outside, the storm raged on. By nightfall, the power went out. The cabin was thrown into darkness, save for the flickering light of the fire. I found a lantern and lit it, its weak glow barely pushing back the shadows. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and making the walls creak. I told myself it was just a storm, that I was safe inside, but something about the night felt off. It started with the knocking. At first, I thought it was the wind, a soft, rhythmic sound against the front door. 3 knocks, then silence. 3 more, then silence again. I sat up, my heart pounding, listening. When it came again, louder this time, I grabbed the lantern and approached the door. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. "Who's there?" No response. Just the wind howling and the snow swirling against the glass. I opened the door a crack, the icy air biting at my face. The porch was empty, the snow untouched. There were no footprints, no sign of anyone. I closed the door quickly, bolting it this time, and returned to the fire. The knocking didn't stop. It moved, first to the windows, then to the walls. It was deliberate, too steady to be the wind. My chest tightened with fear. I checked the windows, shining the lantern into the darkness, but all I could see was the snow. Still, the knocking persisted, as if someone or something was circling the cabin. Then the whispers began. They were faint at first, almost imperceptible, like a breeze brushing past my ear. But as the night wore on, they grew louder. They weren't words I could understand, just murmurs, overlapping and urgent, as if a crowd was gathered outside. My mind raced for an explanation. Was I hallucinating? Was it the storm playing tricks on me? Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the roof. It was impossible, I told myself. The roof was steep and covered in snow. No one could climb up there in these conditions. But the sound was unmistakable, slow, deliberate steps moving from one end of the cabin to the other. I froze, gripping the lantern tightly, my eyes locked on the ceiling. The steps stopped directly above me, and then there was silence. I don't know how long I sat there staring at the ceiling, too afraid to move. Eventually, I must have drifted off because I woke to the sound of something crashing outside. It was still dark, the storm still raging. I grabbed the lantern and peered out the window. In the faint light, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The woodpile I had stacked earlier was scattered across the yard, the logs tossed haphazardly into the snow. And in the middle of the mess were footprints, large, bare footprints that led from the woods to the pile and back again. My stomach churned. There was no way anyone could be walking barefoot in this weather. No way they could survive out there. The whispers returned, louder now, coming from all around the cabin. They were closer, more distinct, though still unintelligible. It felt like they were pressing against the walls, trying to get in. I backed away from the window, my hands trembling. Then I heard the door creak. I spun around, the lantern shaking in my grip. The front door, which I had bolted, was ajar. Snow swirled in through the gap, melting instantly on the wooden floor. My breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I approached the door and pushed it shut, locking it again. But as I turned back to the room, I saw it. A figure stood in the corner, just outside the lantern's glow. It was tall and thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its features were obscured by shadow, but its presence was undeniable. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It didn't make a sound, didn't move toward me. It just stood there. The lantern flickered, and the figure was gone. I don't remember much of the rest of that night. I must have passed out because when I woke, the storm had stopped. Pale light filtered through the windows, and the cabin was eerily quiet. I packed my things in a frenzy, desperate to leave. But as I stepped outside, I froze. The snow around the cabin was covered in footprints. Bare, human-like footprints that circled the building over and over. They led to the door, to the windows, to the roof. My heart raced as I followed them to the edge of the woods where they simply stopped. There were no tracks leading away, no sign of where they had gone. I drove down the mountain as fast as the icy roads would allow, not daring to look back. To this day, I don't know what I encountered that night. I've told myself it was the storm, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know the truth. Something was out there in the snowstorm of January, and it wasn't human. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The snowstorm that swept through in January of 2015 was one for the record books. The news called it the White Shroud, a blizzard that blanketed entire towns and stranded people in their homes for days. I didn't expect to get caught in it, but when I accepted an overnight shift as the on-call maintenance worker for Birchwood Lodge, I found myself in the thick of it. Birchwood Lodge wasn't the cozy ski resort the name might suggest. It was a rundown motel on the outskirts of a dying town in upstate New York. The place had been built in the 1940s and hadn't seen much of an update since. The carpets were threadbare, the wallpaper was peeling, and the boiler only worked when it wanted to. Most of the rooms were empty, especially in the off-season. It was the kind of place people only stayed if they had nowhere else to go or were running from something. That night, the motel had 2 guests. An older couple had checked in earlier in the evening, and their room, number 12, was at the far end of the property. I was holed up in the office, watching the snow whip past the windows. The wind howled like a banshee, shaking the walls. It was one of those storms that felt alive, as if the snow and wind had a mind of their own. Around 10 p.m., the power went out. The fluorescent lights flickered once and died, plunging the office into darkness. I cursed under my breath and grabbed my flashlight. The motel had a backup generator, but it was finicky at best. I bundled up, pulling my jacket tight around me, and stepped out into the storm. The snow was knee-deep already, and the wind cut through my clothes like icy knives. The generator was housed in a small shed behind the main building. As I trudged through the snow, my flashlight beam danced across the landscape, turning the falling flakes into a glittering wall of white. I reached the shed and yanked open the door, the wind slamming it shut behind me. Inside, the generator sat in stubborn silence. I checked the fuel, which was fine, then tried to start it manually. The machine coughed but wouldn't catch. I muttered a string of curses and was about to try again when I heard it. A knock. Faint, but deliberate. It came from the far side of the shed, the side facing the woods. I froze. The snowstorm was deafening, but the knock had been clear, like someone rapping their knuckles against the wood. I swung the flashlight toward the noise and opened the door a crack. The wind blasted in, but the space beyond was empty. Just the edge of the forest, the snow falling in thick, swirling sheets. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely audible over the storm. No response. I shut the door quickly, my heart thudding in my chest. It had to be my imagination. Or maybe a branch had hit the shed. I focused on the generator, finally coaxing it to life. The motel lights flickered back on, casting a pale glow over the snow-covered lot. As I stepped outside, something caught my eye. Footprints. They started at the edge of the woods and led straight toward the shed, toward me. The snow was fresh, and the prints were sharp and defined, but there was no one there and no tracks leading away. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I followed the prints a few steps, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The tracks were long and narrow, not quite human. They stopped just short of the shed, as if whatever had made them had simply vanished. My breath fogged in the freezing air, and I backed away, heading quickly toward the main building. Inside, the office was warm and lit again, but the unease from the shed stayed with me. I tried to shake it off, pouring myself a cup of coffee and settling into the chair by the desk. The wind rattled the windows and the storm seemed to grow louder, almost angry. I checked the security cameras, which showed nothing but static-filled feeds of the snow-covered lot. Around midnight, the phone rang. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Picking it up, I recognized the voice of the older man staying in room 12. "There's someone outside," he said, his voice trembling. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I saw someone," he insisted, walking past the window, but when I looked out, there were no tracks. And he hesitated, his breath shaky. It didn't look right. I told him I'd check it out and grab my flashlight again. The last thing I wanted was to go back out there, but it was my job. I trudged through the snow toward room 12, my eyes scanning the darkness. The snow was still falling hard, erasing any tracks almost as soon as they were made. When I reached the room, the older man, Mr. Davis, cracked the door open. His face was pale, and his wife sat on the bed behind him, clutching a blanket. "It went that way," he said, pointing toward the woods, "but it didn't leave footprints." I nodded, though my stomach churned. I shined the flashlight toward the trees, but there was nothing there, just the snow and the shadows. "It's probably just the storm," I said, trying to reassure him. "Snow plays tricks on your eyes." He didn't look convinced, but thanked me anyway. I returned to the office, but I couldn't sit still. Something was out there. I could feel it. Around 2 a.m., the knocking started. This time it came from the office door. 3 sharp knocks, followed by silence. I approached the door slowly, every instinct telling me not to open it. Through the frosted glass, I could just make out a figure standing in the snow. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and unmoving. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No response. The figure didn't move. I gripped the doorknob, my hand shaking, and cracked the door open. The freezing wind rushed in, but the figure was gone. The snow outside was undisturbed, no footprints leading to or away from the door. I slammed it shut, bolting it this time. The knocking started again, this time at the windows. It moved quickly, impossibly fast, circling the office. I could hear the taps against the glass, the sound filling the small space. My heart raced as I backed into the corner, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. Then the power went out again. The darkness was absolute. The knocking stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. My breathing was loud in my ears, each exhale a cloud in the freezing air. The room grew colder, and I could feel someone watching me. I swung the flashlight around, and for a brief moment, the beam caught something in the corner. A face, pale and hollow, with empty black eyes that seemed to stare straight through me. I screamed, dropping the flashlight. When I scrambled to pick it up and shined it again, the corner was empty. I don't remember much after that. Somehow I made it through the night, huddled in the office with the lights back on and the fire burning as brightly as I could manage. When dawn finally came, the storm had passed. The snow glittered in the morning light, untouched and pristine. But as I walked the property to check for damage, I saw them. Footprints. They circled the motel, stopping at each door and each window, and then disappeared into the woods. I quit that job the same day. Whatever was out there in the snowstorm of January, it wasn't human, and it wasn't bound by the rules of the living. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The snowstorm of January 2017 was one of the worst I'd ever seen. I had lived my whole life in the rural outskirts of Vermont, where blizzards were just a part of life. But this storm was different, angrier somehow. By midday, the wind was howling through the trees, rattling the old farmhouse windows like an unseen force trying to get in. I had planned to ride it out alone, but by the time night fell, I regretted not driving to town while I still could. The farmhouse had been in my family for generations, an old clapboard structure surrounded by dense woods. My parents had left it to me after they passed, but I had never gotten around to fixing it up. The place had its quirks, drafty corners, creaking floorboards, but it was home. That night, though, it felt like something else entirely. I sat in the living room by the fireplace, watching the flames dance. The power had gone out hours earlier, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Snow piled against the windows, and the wind screamed like a living thing. I had lit every candle I could find, but the house still felt dark, as if the shadows were thicker than they had any right to be. Then, at around 9 p.m., I heard it. a faint knock at the front door. It was so soft I thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again. 3 deliberate raps. My stomach tightened. Who could possibly be out in this storm? I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the door, the wooden floor groaning under my feet. "Hello?" I called through the door, my voice trembling. The storm howled in response. I hesitated, then opened the door a crack. The freezing wind whipped past me, sending snow swirling into the hallway. The porch was empty. The snow on the steps was untouched, pristine. No footprints. I closed the door quickly, bolting it shut. My pulse was racing, but I told myself it was just the wind. Maybe a branch had hit the door. That had to be it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I returned to the living room, but the fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. I stoked it back to life and sat down, pulling a blanket around my shoulders. The storm seemed louder now, the wind screaming through the eaves like a warning. The knocking came again, this time at the back door. 3 soft, deliberate raps, just like before. My hands trembled as I grabbed the flashlight again, the beam shaking as I made my way through the darkened house. The back door led to the kitchen, a small room with a single window overlooking the woods. I paused in the doorway, listening. The knock came again, louder this time. "Who's there?" I called, my voice echoing the empty house. No response. I moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The window beside the door was frosted over, but I thought I saw a shadow move outside. I froze, staring at the glass, but it was impossible to tell if it was real or just the storm playing tricks on me. I didn't open the door this time. Instead, I backed away, returning to the living room. The knocking stopped, but the uneasy feeling in my chest didn't go away. It felt like the house was holding its breath, like something was waiting. Then I heard footsteps upstairs. They were slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud in the silent house. I stood frozen, staring at the ceiling as the sound moved from one end of the second floor to the other. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering out for a moment before coming back to life. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely more than a whisper. The footsteps stopped. I didn't want to go upstairs, but I couldn't ignore the sound. I grabbed the poker from the fireplace, holding it like a weapon, and climbed the stairs slowly. Each step groaned under my weight, the noise loud enough to make me flinch. The upstairs hallway was dark, the only light coming from my trembling flashlight. I checked each room, one by one. First the guest bedroom, then the bathroom, then the old nursery. All of them were empty. The last door was my bedroom. It was closed, though I didn't remember closing it. My hand shook as I reached for the knob. I opened the door slowly, the flashlight casting a narrow beam across the room. It was empty, just as I'd left it. But as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there. The room was freezing now, my breath visible in the dim light. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if something unseen was pressing down on me. Then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, just outside the flashlight's beam, was a figure. It was tall and shadowy, its edges flickering like smoke. It didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and piercing. My knees buckled, and I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. The beam spun wildly, illuminating the walls, the ceiling, the floor, but when it landed on the corner again, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire with my back to the wall, the poker clutched tightly in my hands. The storm raged on, the wind howling and the house creaking like it was alive. The knocking didn't come again, but I felt watched, as if the shadows themselves were alive. When morning finally came, the storm had passed. Pale sunlight filtered through the windows, and the snow outside glittered like diamonds. I ventured out into the yard, needing to feel the daylight on my skin. The world was silent, the snow undisturbed, except for the footprints. They circled the house, stopping at each door and window. They were large and bare, the toes long and clawed. My stomach churned as I followed them to the edge of the woods, where they simply ended. I didn't stay long after that. I packed my things and left the farmhouse that same day, leaving behind the memories of that night. I sold the property a few months later, unwilling to set foot in it again. To this day, I don't know what I encountered during the snowstorm of January. Some nights, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can still hear the knocking. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The snowstorm came unexpectedly that January, the kind of storm that traps you in its unrelenting grip. Uh, our small mountain town was used to harsh winters, but this was different. The snow fell in waves, heavy and wet, piling up against doors and windows. Wind howled like a living thing, rattling homes and shaking confidence. By the second night, the roads were impassable, the power lines down. We were stranded. I was house-sitting for the Sloan family, whose cabin was perched on the edge of the woods. They'd gone south for the winter, leaving me to look after their place. It was an easy gig: feed the dog, keep the pipes from freezing, and enjoy the peace. But that peace evaporated as the storm took hold. On the first night of the blizzard, I was jolted awake by a thud against the cabin's front door. At first, I thought it might be a fallen branch, but the sound came again, deliberate and heavy, like a fist knocking. Pulling my blanket tight around me, I crept to the window and peered out. Snow swirled so thickly I couldn't see more than a few feet, but I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow, large and indistinct, retreating into the trees. The next morning, I found strange tracks in the snow, leading from the woods to the door and back again. They weren't animal prints, nor did they look quite human. They were too long, with a strange, clawed outline. I told myself it was just my imagination. The snowstorm and isolation were playing tricks on me. But something about those tracks unsettled me. That night, the knocking returned, louder and more insistent. This time, I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door, despite my pounding heart. Nothing but the storm greeted me, snow whipping in wild spirals and the bitter cold biting at my face. I stepped onto the porch and shone the light around, but the beam caught only empty drifts. As I turned to go back inside, I heard it. A low, guttural sound, halfway between a growl and a moan. It came from the woods, deep and resonant, and it raised every hair on my body. The dog, a golden retriever named Max, whimpered at my side, tail tucked between his legs. He barked once, sharply, and then retreated under the couch, refusing to come out. I locked the door, bolted it, and double-checked every window. Sleep didn't come easy that night. On the third day, the storm grew worse, and so did the unease. I was shoveling snow off the porch when I noticed something sticking out of the snowbank near the tree line. Curious, I trudged through the knee-deep snow to investigate. It was a scarf, red and frayed at the edges, frozen stiff. When I picked it up, a chill ran through me. Not from the cold, but from the realization that it was the same scarf Mrs. Sloan had worn in a photo on the mantel. But how had it gotten here? They'd left weeks ago, far beyond the reach of this storm. That night, the noises began inside the house. Floorboards creaked when I wasn't moving. Cabinets opened and closed on their own, softly at first, then with increasing force. At one point, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs, heavy, deliberate steps that crossed from one end of the hallway to the other. Max growled low in his throat, staring fixedly at the staircase. My heart pounded as I crept up the steps, flashlight in hand. The air grew colder with each step, and by the time I reached the top, I could see my breath in front of me. I pushed open the door to the master bedroom, and the beam of light swept across the room. At first, it seemed empty, but then I saw it. A figure standing by the window, staring out into the storm. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by a tangle of dark hair. It didn't turn, but I felt its attention shift to me, as if it knew I was there. The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I stumbled back, the flashlight trembling in my hand. When I looked again, the figure was gone. But the room was wrong. Frost coated the walls and window, and the bed was covered in a thin layer of snow, as if the storm had seeped inside. I fled downstairs, heart racing, and locked myself in the living room with Max. The final night was the worst. The storm was at its peak, wind screaming like a banshee. The knocking returned, louder and more frenzied, but this time it came from every direction. Front door, windows, even the roof. Shadows moved outside, too many to count, flitting just beyond the edge of the storm. And then the whispers began. They were faint at first, like the sound of wind through cracks, but they grew louder, more distinct. Voices, overlapping and echoing, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. They filled the room, pressing in on me, wrapping around my mind like icy fingers. Max barked and growled, his hackles raised, but even he couldn't drown out the sound. I grabbed the fireplace poker, more for comfort than protection, and backed into a corner. The whispers crescendoed, and the air seemed to vibrate with an unseen force. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence was deafening. In the quiet, I heard a single word, clear and unmistakable: leave. I didn't wait for morning. I bundled Max into the truck and drove through the storm, ignoring the icy roads and the howling wind. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, hours away. When I finally dared to look back, the cabin was a distant blur, swallowed by the storm. The Sloans never returned. The property was sold the following spring, but the new owners didn't stay long. Rumors spread about the place, stories of strange noises and shadows that moved on their own. Some said it was haunted by the spirits of those who died in past storms, trapped between worlds. Others claimed it was something older, something that had always been there, waiting in the snow. I don't know what I saw in that cabin, but I'll never forget the feeling, that suffocating presence, the weight of unseen eyes. Even now, years later, I can't hear the howl of the wind without remembering that storm, that house, and the thing that watched me from the shadows. Story, the end.
Story number 9.
The snowstorm of January 2020 is something I'll never forget. It wasn't the kind of storm you could prepare for, so fierce and unrelenting that even seasoned locals were caught off guard. I had planned to spend the weekend at my late aunt's house in the Adirondacks, a secluded cabin she left to me after her passing. I hadn't been there in years, but I figured it would be a good place to clear my head. By the time the snow started falling, it was already too late to leave. The winding road leading to the cabin had become impassable, buried under a thick layer of snow. The cabin itself was small and simple, wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace, and a few pieces of well-worn furniture. It had always been a comforting place in my childhood, but that night, it felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in. The power went out early in the evening. I lit a few candles and got a fire going in the fireplace, trying to keep the growing darkness at bay. The wind outside was deafening, howling through the trees like a living thing. I wrapped myself in a blanket and sat by the fire, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. It started around 10 p.m., just as I was beginning to doze off. A knock at the door. It wasn't loud, just 3 soft taps, deliberate and evenly spaced. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again. I froze. The cabin was miles from the nearest neighbor, and the road was completely buried. No one could have made it through the storm. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. I hesitated, then opened the door a crack. The icy wind rushed in, sending snow swirling across the floor. The porch was empty. The snow was pristine, untouched. There were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. I slammed the door shut, bolting it behind me. My hands were shaking as I stepped back, trying to convince myself it was just the storm. Maybe a branch had hit the door or the wind had shifted it just right. But deep down, I knew better. I returned to the living room, the fire casting flickering shadows across the walls. The knocking didn't come again, but the uneasiness lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around midnight, the footsteps started. They were faint at first, coming from upstairs. The cabin had a small loft that served as a bedroom, but I hadn't been up there since I arrived. The sound was slow and deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. I froze, staring at the ceiling. The footsteps moved from one end of the loft to the other, then stopped. I held my breath, waiting, but the silence stretched on. I told myself it was just the old wood settling, a natural creak in the house. But then they started again, heavier this time, as if someone or something was deliberately letting me know they were there. Gripping the flashlight, I forced myself to climb the narrow staircase to the loft. My hand shook as I pushed open the door, the beam of light sweeping across the small room. It was empty, just as I'd left it. The bed was undisturbed, the blankets neatly folded at the foot, but the air felt colder up there, heavy and still. I backed out of the room and returned to the living room, locking the loft door behind me. I sat by the fire, too afraid to sleep, the poker clutched tightly in my hand. The footsteps didn't return, but the silence was almost worse. It was too quiet, as if the storm outside had paused to listen. At around 3 a.m., the knocking started again. this time at the window. It was louder now, more insistent. 3 sharp raps, followed by a pause, then 3 more. I turned slowly, my stomach twisting in fear. The window was frosted over, but I thought I saw a shadow move on the other side. I didn't dare go closer. I stayed where I was, gripping the poker so tightly my knuckles turned white. The knocking continued for what felt like an eternity, echoing through the small cabin. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the windows, I stepped outside, desperate for the reassurance of daylight. The storm had passed, leaving a thick, undisturbed blanket of snow. But as I stood on the porch, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. They circled the cabin, leading to every door and window. They were large and bare, as if someone had been walking without shoes in the freezing snow. The tracks were fresh, crisp, and impossibly clear, but they didn't lead away. They stopped abruptly about 10 feet from the back door, as if whoever or whatever had made them had simply vanished. I packed my things and left that morning, abandoning the cabin without a second glance. I haven't been back since. To this day, I don't know what I encountered during the snowstorm of January. Maybe it was the isolation, the storm, or my own mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know the truth. Something was out there that night, and it wanted me to know I wasn't alone. Story the end.